The night had no business being that quiet. The trees stood like sentinels, their bare fingers brushing against a low winter fog. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called once, and then silence swallowed everything again. The year was 1807, deep in the rural wilderness of Maine, where lantern light flickered inside log cabins, and every gust of wind seemed to carry whispers not meant for human ears. They said the old woman who lived by the river could make butter curdle with a stare, that she could speak to the wind and have it answer. Her name was Abigail Haskell, a widow who'd survived 2 harsh winters alone after her husband's mysterious death. But to her neighbors, that kind of survival wasn't natural. It was something else, something unnamed. At the turn of the 19th century, America was changing. Cities were rising, ships were crossing the Atlantic faster, and the Enlightenment had supposedly swept away the shadows of superstition. But out here, far from the polished parlors of Boston or Philadelphia, the old beliefs never died. In the backwoods and mountain valleys, from the Carolinas to Vermont, from Ohio's frontier to the edge of the Great Lakes, folklore ruled where law could not reach. These were the unseen wars, not fought with muskets or uniforms, but with words, suspicion, and fear. And they would leave scars just as real. It began, as such things always did, with something small. A farmer named Samuel Cobb awoke one morning to find his oxen dead in the field, their eyes glassy and their bodies cold as stone. No wound, no sickness, just gone. His wife swore she saw strange footprints in the frost, shaped like a woman's but too long, as if the feet had stretched. By sundown, the whispers began. Abigail Haskell cursed them. She's been seen gathering herbs at midnight. She talks to the river. Soon, the local parson was called. Reverend Parris, named after an ancestor who had preached in Salem generations before, warned that the devil was always seeking new ground, especially in places where faith ran thin. And that was enough. Fear does not need proof. It only needs a spark. The small settlement of Wiscasset Hollow was isolated, surrounded by pine and frozen marsh. Its people were proud, poor, and weary from long winters. Their lives were ruled by harvests, weather, and prayer. Every illness, every stroke of bad luck demanded a reason, and when reason failed, blame found a name. That winter, a sickness swept through the town. It took children first, then livestock, and one by one, the neighbors turned their eyes toward the widow by the river. Abigail never fought back. She had no kin, no allies. Her days were spent mending nets, collecting herbs, and sometimes singing old songs from her mother's Irish village. The melodies, strange and mournful, carried through the woods like lamentations. That alone made her dangerous. One night, a search party was formed. They claimed it was for peace of mind. But the truth was darker. Lanterns bobbed through the trees like restless spirits. They found Abigail in her cabin, sitting before the fire, a bowl of steaming herbs on the table. She did not rise. "What is it you think I've done?" she asked softly. No one answered. Then someone, no one would later admit who, knocked the bowl to the floor. The scent filled the room, sharp and earthy. It was nothing but sage and willow bark. But fear twists everything it touches. "She's working charms," someone shouted. And that was the moment the war began. Not between armies, between reason and hysteria, between neighbor and neighbor. Abigail was dragged before a makeshift gathering in the meeting house, a log structure that served as both church and courtroom. There was no lawman present, no official charge. Just angry faces illuminated by candlelight. They spoke of their dead oxen, their sick children, their failing crops. And in their grief, they built a monster out of her silence. Abigail said little. Only once did she raise her head and say, "You call me witch because you cannot understand misfortune." Someone threw a stone. It struck her shoulder and rolled to the floor. The parson read aloud from Exodus, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." By dawn, her cabin was ash. And before the snow melted that spring, 3 more women were accused, 2 healers and a midwife. To understand what happened in Wiscasset Hollow, you have to see the world through 19th century eyes. The American frontier was vast and dangerous. Medicine was primitive. Death was everywhere, childbirth, infection, cold. When tragedy struck, people sought meaning in what they could not control. The folk beliefs they carried from Europe blended with Native American traditions and Christian fear, forming a shadow religion of protection and punishment. Witch bottles buried under thresholds. Iron nails crossed above doors. Hair braided into charms. These were common even in respectable homes. Yet the same acts that protected one family could condemn another. By 1835, similar incidents were reported across Appalachia and New England. In Vermont, a man named Jacob Kent exhumed the body of a woman he claimed bewitched his cattle. He burned her heart in the town square to break the spell. In Pennsylvania, a schoolteacher was beaten nearly to death after rumors spread that his Latin lessons were incantations. And in Tennessee, an entire family, the Bells, claimed they were haunted by a spirit that cursed them for an unpunished sin. The American witch panic of the 1800s never erupted like Salem. It spread slowly, quietly, in isolated bursts, each one consuming a small community before vanishing into silence. Historians would later call it a folk survival, a remnant of Europe's old fears reborn in a new land. But the people who lived through it didn't call it history. They called it justice. The story of Abigail Haskell might have faded into obscurity, but local records from the region still mention her name. In one entry, a sheriff notes an inquiry into the death of a widow found drowned near the Sheepscot River. No witnesses, no burial, just a name erased from the town's memory, but not its guilt. Years later, a traveling preacher passed through the same valley. He wrote in his diary that the air is thick with old superstitions. They speak of a witch's ghost that walks the riverbank, singing the songs of the old country. Locals began to call her the River Widow. Fishermen claimed that on foggy mornings, their nets tore without reason, as if cut from beneath by unseen hands. Children said they heard humming near the water when the wind died. And once, a hunter swore he saw a figure in gray walking across the frozen river, vanishing before she reached the far bank. Superstition feeds on silence. And silence was all Abigail ever had left. But the unseen wars didn't end with her death. Through the 1840s and 1850s, folk healers and cunning women faced growing hostility. The more America industrialized, the more its backwoods clung to old fears. The Civil War would soon tear the nation apart, but in these forgotten corners, the war between reason and superstition was already raging. After the war, the country was bloodied, broken, and uncertain of its own soul. Men came home carrying ghosts, some from the battlefield, some from the things they'd seen in the stillness between cannon fire. Across the Appalachian foothills, in West Virginia, Kentucky, and rural Pennsylvania, the old superstitions found fertile ground once more. Fear always returns where faith and reason collapse. Villagers who had lost sons and fathers began whispering about spirits that walked the woods, about cursed hills where nothing grew, about witches that fed on sorrow. And behind these whispers, the same patterns emerged again. An illness here, a dying crop there, and then a name on everyone's tongue. In the 1870s, one case in particular would show just how deeply these unseen wars had sunk into the American heart. In the small town of Powhatan, Virginia, a midwife named Eliza Dobbins lived alone at the edge of a swamp. Eliza was a healer. She knew the properties of roots and bark, of willow and wild ginseng. She delivered over 50 babies in her lifetime and buried 2 husbands before her 50th year. But her knowledge, passed down through generations of Scots-Irish settlers, walked the uneasy line between medicine and magic. When a fever swept through Powhatan in 1872, it spared no one, not even the preacher's son. The townsfolk, desperate for an explanation, remembered that Eliza had once treated a patient using a charm made of twisted thread and pins. They came for her at dusk. Eliza didn't resist. She simply asked them to let her pray. They tied her hands anyway. The townsmen dragged her to the meeting house, just like they had done with Abigail Haskell decades before. This time, though, there was a judge, a man named William Caraway, who'd seen too much death in the war to believe in witches. He demanded evidence, testimony, logic. But logic meant little to a crowd mourning their dead. When he refused to convict her, the townsfolk took justice into their own hands. That night, Eliza's cabin was set on fire. By morning, there was nothing left but a stone chimney and the iron pot she used for healing herbs. No one ever confessed. And yet, in the weeks that followed, the fever vanished as suddenly as it came. For those who believed, it was proof. For those who doubted, it was coincidence. For those who lived there, it was fear rekindled. From New England to the Carolinas, similar stories appeared in local papers. Woman accused of witchcraft beaten by neighbors, Vermont, 1878. Strange doings in the mountains of North Carolina, 1879. Frontier family flees after superstition turns deadly, Ohio, 1883. Each case was small, isolated, but together they formed a pattern. This was not the witch hysteria of the 1600s. It was something quieter, an infection of belief. A shadow war fought in whispers, over kitchen tables, and in the dark of the woods. Scholars now call it a folk residue, the lingering echo of Europe's witch-hunting centuries that never fully died in the New World. But for those who lived it, it was far more immediate, something alive, unseen, and always waiting. In rural folklore, these tensions birthed an entire mythology: the witch bullet, the hag-ridden dream, the witch ball, and the countercharm. Families passed down rituals of defense, turning shoes backward at the hearth, placing scissors in the cradle to protect newborns, nailing horseshoes to barn doors not for luck but for survival. Even well into the 1890s, when railroads and telegraphs bound the country together, small towns clung to their talismans. Because the unseen wars had never truly ended. By the late 19th century, America was stepping into the modern age: electric light, telephones, moving pictures. But superstition still smoldered beneath the progress. In 1897, in the hills of West Virginia, came one of the last witch cases ever recorded: the story of Zona Hester Shue, known now as the Greenbrier Ghost. Zona was found dead in her home under mysterious circumstances. Her husband claimed it was an accident, but her mother insisted her spirit visited her in the night, telling her she'd been murdered. The authorities exhumed Zona's body, and evidence proved the ghost story true. It became a national sensation, half tragic, half uncanny. The last echo of an age where death and the supernatural still intertwined. And in its strange way, it closed the circle. From Salem's pyres to Maine's frozen riverbanks, from Tennessee's haunted hollows to the quiet graves of Virginia, America's unseen witch wars finally burned themselves out. Not through justice, but exhaustion. Yet folklore is never buried. It only sleeps. Even today, deep in those woods, old stories linger like smoke that refuses to clear. Locals still talk of a chill that comes without wind, of a woman's humming near the river. They don't say her name anymore, but they all know who she is. The River Widow, the midwife in the swamp, the last of the accused. Her song, they say, rises when fog drifts low across the water, soft, mournful, and warning. And if you listen too long, you might start to believe the old saying whispered in those hidden valleys of the backwoods: once the witch is gone, the curse remains. Subscribe for more stories like this.